Hi, I'm Catherine Cheney, DevX's US West Coast correspondent, here in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum annual meetings. And I'm joined by Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister and founder of the Institute for Global Change. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Catherine.
So I've been really eager to interview you because you take a look at the topic of this year's meetings, creating a shared future in a fractured world. That's something you know a lot about and something you're actively working on. So my first question for you is just, what is your main message as you've passed through the promenade, make your way through meetings? What's the message you're trying to get out there?
I think the message is that despite the backlash against globalization, the world is still coming together through technology, migration, trade, commerce, and we've got to find ways to make the world work together better so that we can provide solutions that distribute opportunity and wealth more equally, but keep the enormous benefits of globalization. And we've got to remember, in the Western world, there's a lot of anxiety, cultural and economic, about the way the world's changing. But actually, you take a step back and you look at the world as a whole. In the last few decades, we've lifted more people out of poverty than ever before in the history of humanity. If you look at Africa, where I do a lot of work, the death rates from killer diseases are all down. The middle class will double in the next 10 years. The developing world sees actually a greater sense of optimism about the future than the developed world, which is in the throes of this big economic cultural change and is anxious and worried about it. So the fracturing that is the risk is where the West world turns it back in on itself, becomes isolationist, protectionist, nativist, anti-immigrant, at the very moment when actually we need to partner the developing world more closely and realize that what we have in common is so important and so much more important than what divides us.
Now, I know that governance has increasingly become a focus, and you've written very openly about some of the transitions and how in your approach. But previously, your organization had faith in its name. And I want to hear where the role of faith continues to fit in to the work that you do.
So essentially the Institute, I used to have different organizations, there were different charities. I brought them all together under one roof in one institute, a not-for-profit institute, and we work on the things that we need to tackle if we're going to make globalization work for people. I mean, I'm essentially in favor of this process of globalization. I think the more we open up to each other, the better. But what are the things that hold us back from that? So we work on governance, because in poor countries, bad governance is the single biggest problem that they face. Yeah. So that explains our work in Africa and elsewhere. We work on establishing good relations across the boundaries of faith and culture, because extremism based on an abuse of religious faith is still the biggest security threat we face. And it also, of course, if it takes root, as a great inhibition to globalization working. Then thirdly, we look at the Middle East specifically, because there's a big focus of our work where I think that a lot of the problems of this extremism come out of the Middle East, and we've got to work on how we get a Middle East that is basically religiously tolerant and with rule-based economies. And then finally, we've started this new bit of work in the last year or so, which is about, for the Western world, how do we get the progressive center back as the place of change? Okay, so how do we find solutions to the problems of the US and Europe and so on that are real, that provide answers and don't just ride the anger? So,
and I'm curious, in all of these aims, these interrelated goals, why is this an interesting place for you to be right now?
Right, because when you come here, I mean, look, there's a sense of which, you look at Davos and it's all the great and the good mingling together.
Right.
But actually underneath that, so 2 sessions I did this week, one on the Middle East, where we were specifically talking in a very private and quiet way between the leaders of the Middle East about how we make peace. And then secondly, a session on Africa, which is all around this issue of governance and how we make sure that the positive changes that are happening in Africa at the moment are encouraged.
Now, I want to understand where you see work in governance and aid. I've read some things you've mentioned where you say aid still has its place, but it's not going to deliver results without governance. So our community at DevX is working in foreign aid, global health, international development, humanitarian response. What's your message for them specifically as sort of partners in this effort?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, when I was Prime Minister, we put Africa at the centre of the G8 summit in 2005. I set up our Department of International Development. We trebled the aid budget of the country. We've now got a 0.7% commitment that the British government, through successive governments, has now maintained. So I'm a big supporter of aid, and it does work. I mean, you can see the programs around the world where the lives have been saved, and of course, the US PEPFAR program is probably one of the biggest lifesavers in the history of development policy. Right. But it's not enough.
Right.
So it's not an either or, it's a and. The importance of governance is that if you look around the world today, countries that you can actually see them side by side. One succeeds, one fails. Roughly the same population, roughly the same potential. So why does one succeed and one fail? Governance. So if you look at Colombia, Venezuela, okay, or you look at Poland and Ukraine, or you look at Rwanda and Burundi, or the greatest experiment in governance the world has actually seen, which is the Korean Peninsula, okay, North and South Korea. So what's the difference? I mean, the difference is in the quality of governance, which is not just about transparency, it's also about effectiveness. So this is what we work on. We have projects in 13 different African countries now. We have teams of people go live and work in those countries. I work with the president, the teams work with the president's teams, and we just try and deliver the priorities of the country and encourage the building of the capacity to govern effectively.
Now, when it comes to capacity building, I'd love to hear about your own learnings. So can you give us an example of something where you tried something and it didn't quite work, you had to adapt? I think your learnings in that kind of adaptation process would be very useful.
Yeah, so the very reason I work on governance is my experience of 10 years as Prime Minister. You know, when you first, I mean, one of the interesting things about politics is that, you know, you can, the skill set that makes you a great campaigner to win an election, right, is not necessarily the skill set that helps you govern. Right?
Makes sense.
Because when you're campaigning, you're going to be the great presenter, but when you're governing, you've got to be a competent executive.
Yeah.
Okay, and I spent my first term in government realizing that this required a much deeper reflection on how you govern. Okay, and so to give you an example, you know, I thought with our healthcare system, if I just beat the system harder, it would deliver. And frankly, it did deliver a bit more when we beat it harder. But then when you stop beating it, it stopped delivering. So in the second term, I was much more about, well, how do we reform it structurally to make it work much more effectively? If I was back in government today, for example, I would be relentlessly focused on technology.
Right.
Not just about how do you regulate these big companies, which is where the debate often is with public policy, but how do you access the opportunities of a technological change that should revolutionize healthcare, education, probably transport, even things like housing, even things like law and order. So the thing about governance is that it's, you know, you somewhere around the world, it's working.
Right.
If you've got a problem, you will find a solution, but you've got to be prepared to be open to new thinking and ideas. You've got to get people who've got real experience of delivering things alongside you in government, and you've got to realize that government isn't just about sitting there with a manifesto and saying, here's what we should do. It's about executive capability.
Yeah.
And so that's really, you know, what we work on, and we work in many different aspects of it. And, you know, I am passionate about this because I think if you could learn the lessons of governance and apply them in developing countries, you can accelerate the process of development, you know, in an extraordinary way.
What's an example of a particular country you've worked with, leader you've worked with, where the approach has worked? And can you zoom in exactly on how that approach has delivered results?
Right, so I would say if you take, for example, Rwanda, you know, you can see, I mean, there are lots of political challenges, but you can see how, as a result of a strong, capable leadership that's rooted out corruption, provided security in the country, and then has taken decisions, for example, to welcome in foreign investment, to create predictable rules, to focus down on core questions, to put in place competent teams that are properly empowered. You know, there is a reason why that's on its way to second world status, whereas the next door Burundi is frankly, you know, in disarray. And you know, but you can see this in different parts of the world. I mean, if you take, for example, let's take South Korea and Singapore.
Yeah.
So in the 1960s, South Korea and Singapore had a GDP per head roughly the same as some of the poorest African countries. Right, today they're first world countries. So how have they done that? By governance. You know, Lee Kuan Yew's leadership in Singapore, and then the changes South Korea made over time. And you know, this is so. One of the things we try to do in the institute also is draw out the intellectual, to build up intellectual capital around what are the ideas that work. So,
right.
Big problem in developing world. How do you do power infrastructure?
Absolutely.
Today, if you have access to electricity, you have access to the world. So how do you create the right regulatory structure that allows you to encourage investors? You know, how do you have the right mix of off-grid and mini-grid solutions that allows you to reach some of the remote areas without having to put the whole of the infrastructure of the grid in place? How do you get predictable rules for investors to come in and build power plants and build capacity? You know, these are, if you look around the world today, you can derive from experience the right things to do.
So that's really interesting to hear. So when you're working with a given leader, a given government, you're not just looking within their borders, you're looking beyond their borders and fostering conversations among leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we do, for example, today, because I'm interested in the Middle East, I also try and build ties between, for example, Israel and the Gulf countries and African countries. You know, because actually there's lots, for example, Israel's developing technology that's really interesting around water and irrigation and agriculture, and in times of biomedicine and so on. So these are interesting things for countries to know about. One of the problems of being a leader of a country is, and I kind of can reflect on this having spent 10 years out of office, is you go out after office and you kind of see the world. You know, you are absorbing the experiences there. But if you're in your own country and you come to power, you often just don't know what's out there.
Right.
So one of the things I encourage is people to go out and look for ideas. One of the things I'd love to do, by the way, and I'm discussing with people in Silicon Valley at the moment, is how do you put the best minds there on the problems these developing countries have? How do you experiment with the technological change that's being developed in the West Coast in countries in Africa where, frankly, you know, they may find it easier to try and trial their technologies, and these countries are very open to experimentation. And you know, there are ways, for example, I think in respect to technology in healthcare and education, in which some of these countries could develop in a way that doesn't make them have to go through the legacy systems of the West in order to get to the future.
Well, Rwanda's a great example, and there was actually news this week around drones and how Rwanda is opening up to drones in a big way. I'm very interested to follow that Silicon Valley engagement. That's where I'm based and what I cover for DevX, and I think that's really exciting. I want to ask you about the broader context here, because you know, you're doing this work in governance, and yet it seems to me that governance as a whole is underfunded and perhaps undervalued. So I wonder, is part of your mission to make the case for others to get more involved in governance, and what needs to happen for that to be achieved?
No, so this is absolutely vital, because truthfully, if there is a problem with aid, it's that the aid that the West delivers is often, one, far too bureaucratic, and that's the real reason why, by the way, why Africa has opened up to China.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's not sufficiently equipped to support good governance. I mean, it will support good governance in the sense of, you know, human rights or transparency, and these things are very important, but it doesn't support building the capacity to govern in the sense of the capability to change a system or to implement a system. And I would like to see a much bigger focus from the aid world on, for example, how do you put together the rudiments of rule of law? Okay, now I think one of the things I have discovered out in the world is just, we take, in America or the UK, we take the rule of law for granted.
Right.
But and therefore as a result, we don't quite understand the fundamental significance of the rule of law to the development of a country. If you have the rule of law, everything is possible. If you don't have the rule of law, well, you might get from third world to second world status, but I can't think of a single first world country that doesn't have the rule of law. So, you know, and yet the lessons of how you create the right system are, again, quite clear. So I would like to see aid policy also try and learn some of these lessons and apply them.
I think that's a really important message, and I'm glad you mentioned it. So just to close here, I know you have a lot of meetings and places to be. Again, we have a unique audience at DevX. That was, in a sense, a call to action, I think, of how we can do our work more effectively. But our motto and mission at DevX is do good, do it well. And so I, as a reporter, am trying to do that for our community, highlight effective approaches. I think this interview already contains a lot of great insights, but anything we didn't get to that you'd want to add for this unique audience?
I think one thing I would say is that, there's a feeling sometimes that if you come from the developed world and you go into the developing world, I'm very keen to change the kind of donor-recipient mentality of development. On the other hand, sometimes you can take that to the extent that you think, well, maybe people will resent it if we're going into a country and bringing expertise from the outside. Funnily enough, we find in our projects this really isn't the case. People are delighted if they've got if they've got the ability to access people with experience, with ideas. And I find particularly in Africa, where we've got teams of people in these countries, we actually, the people that come and work in these countries with us, they have a fabulous time because they're working right at the centre of government. They can really feel they're delivering, and there's a much greater openness now to working with outsiders than when I first started doing this. So I think one thing I would say to your audience and community is, this is really important work. It really does make a difference. In all the countries we work in, I can see literally, you can measure this in lives improved and lives saved. And, it's a great endeavour to be involved in, and it's one of the most fulfilling things you'll ever do in your life.
Well, I'm really grateful for your time and glad that your perspective is here in Davos. I mean, it's a topic that I don't think we could reach this shared future in this fractured world without the work of governance. So thanks for what you do, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Catherine.